Bounce around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
You're going to think the cheese slipped off the cracker with me, but I went out there and howled like a wolf.
Can you do that coyote howl for us?
Yes, please.
No, it's a wolf.
Oh, it's wolf.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I'm going to have to work that wolf howl into the introduction along with Toot Toot all aboard. It's just going to be one of those things that will become a signature for the whole thing. We are here. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Dave Trafford here, and we are recording a day earlier, but kind of glad because, holy cow, there's a ton that's happened in the last 5 days. So there's lots to talk about. We get around the table. Tim Hudak is here, former leader of the PC party. Keith Leslie joining us from Antigonish, Nova Scotia. The former Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, is here. And our resident pollster, John Wright. And I heard you on the radio this morning, Tim Hudak, talking to John Tory about the wolf howl. And John was talking about how he makes all the animal noises for his grandchildren. For the record, we have the loon call at the cottage with everybody. So we get out there with all of the grandkids, and it's woo, woo, and we get them all to call the loons, and the loons come.
That's very nice.
So it's yeah. So it's just, I think that's a necessary part of all of a sudden public life now.
It's the missing piece, right? I just needed that one animal sound to put me over the top.
Well, it was amusing listening to you and John Tory talk about that's why you hadn't been premier, that you hadn't done animal calls.
Just clear conclusion. Clearly, there's no other conclusion you could draw.
Right.
Yeah, and we all do these panels, right? So John Tory on News Talk this Wednesday morning started with that topic about the wolf howl, and I'm panicking, thinking, is he going to ask me to do my best animal sound? Because I got nothing. Like the closest I get, Dave, is our dog is an Australian Shepherd. So Melbourne will regularly talk to my two daughters, Miller and Melbourne, with the really bad Australian accent. Like, good morning, girls. Get some dog food on the barbie. That's about the extent I can do an animal impersonation.
Imitation of the dog, is it?
Exactly.
Good. Oh, well, look at that. We're 2.5 minutes into it, and it's already off the rails. So
that's why Rob Ferguson gets the big bucks at the Toronto Star, because he Premier, would you give us that wolf howl, please? Well, of course I will. You got to ask the question. They're not going to volunteer that kind of stuff. You got to get in there and ask the question. So I remember, if you remember back, I think it was during Premier Wynne's administration, they were going to bring back the Ontario song for tourism. And Jim Bradley was the tourism minister, and we asked him to sing it, and he would not. You're not getting me on tape thinking that. But you have to ask these things. So kudos to Fergie for asking the Premier to give the wolf howl. That's, as you say, that little meme's going to be around for a while.
Yeah, well, it's right up there, Kathleen, with him swallowing a bee. So, right? He's got the whole animal kingdom going for him.
Hovering around his head. Yeah.
That's it. All right, let's get to something of substance. And just almost, a few minutes after we posted last week's podcast, the Premier was in Sault Ste. Marie, and in an unrelated news conference, he was asked about what was going on in Kitchener-Waterloo. And I know the media's been around the horn on this a couple times, but I still think there's some deeper conversation to be had. And let's start with the Premier's response to the judge's ruling that essentially said they have to find alternate arrangements for an encampment in Waterloo so that they can move the homeless encampment. Otherwise, they're going to sit where they are. And the Premier, among other reasons, is annoyed because this is holding up a Metrolinx project and a transit hub in the region. So his comments are not unpredictable or, unusual. But if you're watching the video, just watch the body language of everyone around the Premier here.
It's the most ridiculous ruling I've ever seen. Don't get me wrong, I have a great deal of respect for our judge of Supreme Court but he comes out with this cockamamie idea that they're going to hold up an encampment, they're going to hold up transit. So for what, 30 people, they're going to hold up millions and millions of riders, communities and everything, saying you can't go in there, you can't touch them. So guess what, folks? Anyone can show up in your backyard. I wish they'd show up in this judge's backyard and set up camp. It's the craziest thing I've ever heard. You can't move them on. We'll give them shelter and take care of these folks. But the judge is saying that we got to hold up projects and everything. I wish I could get that guy's address. I'll send 50 encampments in his backyard and see how he likes it. The craziest decision I've ever heard. But there's a lot of crazy decisions coming from our courts lately.
If you were watching, Vic Fideli is there, Melanie Joly is there, standing right beside the premier, and I don't know who was on his left. He was bug-eyed as this whole thing was coming out. Vic Fideli looked uncomfortably, kind of looking off to one side, and Melanie Joly looked like she was the cat that had just swallowed the mouse. She was trying to suppress a grin, just in terms of all that was playing out. Tim, again, he's playing to type, but there are times when, talk about slipping off the cracker. This is one of those moments where maybe his comms people are pulling their hair out.
We made that joke, and you started with it, that the most common phrase in media was at an unrelated press conference, Premier Ford said, and as a result, there wasn't a consistent message. And we did see a number of things that led to a slide in the Conservative fortunes in Ontario and the Premier's personal ratings. It's what happens if you don't stick to your theme. And I don't know what was displaced here, right? So I'm sometimes mixed, because when I heard this, I said, damn right. Like, I thought that decision was cockamamie as well, right? The notion that you can't move forward with the project because homeless people have been, in a parking lot. So it's like you move them to another spot, you have to have, equal or better. I just think this is a classic example of judges going way too far and interpreting, the Constitution in ways that was never contemplated. So I don't know what the tag off here was. As Sault Ste. Marie Regional Event still got the message out. There is that danger. But on this one, again, I leapt off my chair and said, damn right.
Yeah, except that there were other jurisdictions, municipalities that have accommodated this. They've taken that into account, Kathleen, where they have said, we're going to move them and we're going to do these things. So there's already precedent for it. Now, whether or not they're holding up a transit project was a different issue, and I understand that there's a frustration behind that. But there already seems to have been best practices in place here that we could be following.
So my deep concern with this whole piece is that that the Premier would not understand or would not acknowledge that the issue is that there doesn't seem to be a place for these people to go. I mean, that is the issue. And secondly, that he's not saying, he's going to pitch in and work with the municipality to figure out the solution. Because if there is a project that's being held up, I mean, that's a serious issue for sure. But the human issue is that these people need a place to be. As you say, Dave, there have been other jurisdictions that have found a way to accommodate this. I think there is, though, a real concern about particularly smaller municipalities not having the resources to provide, not just the housing, but the services, because, 4 walls and a roof is not necessarily the solution to people who have multi-layered issues. And so there have to be supports, there have to be social service supports, and there has to be housing. Both those things need to be in place. And I can only assume that the municipality is struggling to find those resources, and that the premier then lashes out and makes it about the judge as opposed to the social issue. I mean, it's just so beside the point. I can hardly stand it. And he doesn't even acknowledge that. He doesn't say anything about the core issue, which is I just think it's reprehensible, quite frankly.
Well, the over the top part of that whole conversation, John, was I'm be happy to send 50 encampments to his backyard. I'm seriously, I mean, really, that's a that's where you're going to go with that conversation?
Well, a couple of things on that. Number one is we haven't seen the Premier out freelancing as much as that over the last few weeks. The polling numbers are out now. Abacus has the Conservatives back up to 41. Hang the hat on the issue of, well, at the time there was the jet, and that's what everybody focused on. I personally don't buy that. I think it's more of just a lot more of what we just saw now. And when you pull the Premier back, that things get a little bit better. To the substance of what it is, I think, premiers have to be pretty measured in their responses. They should be. We saw Wab Canoe yesterday talk about, the Danielle Smith referendum and handled it in a very, very significant yet very measured way and was able to get the point across. And in these cases, I mean, it could have been answered by simply saying, look, these are tough times for municipalities and people who are, facing economic consequences. We have strong mayor's powers. We're doing everything we can on the housing front to get affordable housing built. We're moving forward and working with the municipalities in all of these areas, and it's unfortunate, but the judge has made a decision, and we're working within that confine, and we're doing our best. Next question, please. I mean, that's kind of how you had. I mean, you could have moved in that direction and just kind of done it, right? But it isn't, and that's the thing. This is, and I mean, you can make all the arguments. Well, it appeals to his base and things like all that sort of stuff. I think again, we're about to go into some pretty difficult times because of the wave of inflation that's on its way. It will be here. It will happen. We will probably have more of this. And to double down on a judge's ruling doesn't really solve anything. It doesn't put you in a position where you've got people working with you and focusing on what really needs to be done. So I think, going forward, what we saw there was the old Premier where the numbers have come way down. And what we're seeing, what we could or should be seeing is the new Premier, which is basically more measured in response.
Yeah, Keith, what strikes me about this kind of response is that this wasn't out of the blue. This has been in the courts for years in terms of what's been going on in that part of the world. And there were already court rulings and decisions that have not been appealed as far as I can tell. But anyway, so he would have been briefed well in advance and before that question ever came up to have that almost off the handle response to something that you should have seen coming a mile away. To me, I back to John's point, really, that's the appropriate response.
Well, homelessness, as we know, is demonstrably and measurably worse under this government than it was before this government took power. It has gotten much, much worse. So clearly, he'd rather talk about the judge and the judge's actions in this issue than talk about the court issue itself of homelessness. And again, the judge's ruling, the Premier stops short. He says, this judge says they can't be moved. The rest of the sentence, unless there's somewhere else for them to go. That's a reasonable part of the whole argument for the judge to make. I agree. It's the judge's ruling does seem a bit over the top, especially with the major transit project here. But the Premier instantly went to, as you say, I'm going to send protesters to your backyard, to the judge's backyard. I mean, for goodness, I wish I had his address. Come on. The last thing, and I know Premier Ford has experienced this when his brother was mayor, protesters or reporters showing up at their house. They don't want that. It should never happen. Private homes should be restricted, private, even of public officials. It just shouldn't happen. And here's him urging people to go to a judge's backyard. Just so far over the top. Backyard camps. I mean, for goodness sakes. Later on, though, he got to the core of the issue. I mean, it's upset him so much, he's ready to use the notwithstanding clause. And that's, I think, where he'll end up having to go with it.
Well, I'm just on the opposite side of you guys on this issue. Maybe I'm wrong. I understand the Premier's frustration that judges are increasingly weighing to things that should be settled in the legislature. Is it a good topic to debate, do more for the homeless? Absolutely. But we don't walk in with the robes and the gavels and the wig, right? We actually walk in there as legislators. This is not the judge's territory. And I think there's a frustration from the Premier. I feel it. I bet his cabinet does and other members of the Assembly. And I will wager a lot of the average public think this decision is way out there. They understand the Premier is upset. And I think this actually connects. I could be wrong. I'm 1 of 5 here. But my gut tells me this resonates.
Yeah, but I think I would agree that there are judicial decisions that are being made that may infuriate me or others. And I agree with you, Tim, in the sense that if you took public opinion nowadays and you simply asked the question, should they be allowed to stay there? The answer would be a hard no. And we weren't in the courtroom or heard all the arguments that were being made. I think it's more of the character assessment in terms of how one says these things. And again, I come back to it and say that the Premier may be right on so many of these things, but the question is, do you want to kind of get way over your skis in an announcement and say all of these things as opposed to low bridging it, looking the way you should in a situation like this? So I think it's more of he's got a thing in for judges who have been making decisions about everything from unions and the work, and all the other issues around this. It's more tone than it is substance, but I think that the public would be on side just prima facie with what they would know from this case.
Well, but okay, that's the political conversation, right? So
Yeah.
You're probably right, John. The public would be on side. And Tim, that's probably true. But if the government is not putting in place the supports that municipalities and therefore human beings need, then this is the kind of decision that gets made. When the jails are full and people are let out on bail, and there aren't the system's not working, people are not moving through the system, then the jails fill up and you get more people on bail. So I mean, we have to look at what's going on in the government that's not allowing the policies to be in place that support the judicious running of our society. Yeah, we can talk about the politics of it. And, you talk about there being two premiers, the first premier and the second premier. There's one premier, and he reverts to form when he gets frustrated, when he's not being reined in by his staff, when, we are hearing really what he believes. He gets mad, he loses his temper, and his bully personality comes out, send them over to the judge's house. Well, that is who the man is. And I'm not arguing that during the pandemic he didn't read the teleprompter and become a different person in the eyes of the public. I think that's true. But you can see without those guardrails around him, this is who he is. He gets frustrated with poor people getting in the way. He's not interested in social services. He's not interested in complicated policy, because it is complicated policy. It's not just about building houses. And quite frankly, the houses that he talks about building are single-family dwellings that have absolutely nothing to do with the people who are in camps, in the parks. Different population. So he's not interested, or at least I haven't seen any evidence of him being interested in the social policy that actually would help the people in those encampments. So yeah, the judge steps in and does something that the government is not doing. Well, we can argue we don't like that, but then the second part of that argument has to be, and the government has to step up and do what's right and make sure that people have a place to be and the municipalities have the resources. I think we let this premier off the hook because of his folksy kind of ignorance of how society actually works and what government's job is.
So go ahead, Tim.
Yeah. Look, I think what folks are missing here is the elixir that's been built up in public opinion here. And look at like the heart hubs, for example, I think are a very important innovation in treating addiction and homelessness, finding shelters that are actually making efforts in this area. But what's combustible here is judges going far beyond their mandate on things people understand, like bike lanes would be another one, the constitutional right to having a bike lane. And you combine that with, I think, a growing frustration, a feeling of lack of safety about the growing homelessness problem. Yep, treatment's important, finding shelters, absolutely. But when those two things come together, and the public says, this is ridiculous, that a homeless encampment can stop a project from going through, that we have to build a shelter before we can move them anywhere. That's a good debate for legislature. But the role of the judge and the gavel? No way.
So would this be an issue, though, Tim, if it weren't centered on the transit hub? Because if this had just been a conversation about moving them off of the parking lot on public property, it would not catch fire. The premier wouldn't necessarily be hair on fire, literally, figuratively. And the issue here is the bylaw itself that the judge has taken issue with. He said the bylaw is unconstitutional. So it's got nothing to do with whether, and he acknowledged that there's public good in the transit hub. but at the heart of it, the bylaw is unconstitutional.
Yeah, I mean, there's two questions in there. So I just sharply disagree with this right to occupy, right, wherever you want to. I just don't think that's role for the judge. I think it's very valid for debate. Good critique for opposition parties to lead in the House. But does that seem like something that I want our courts to interpret the bylaws unconstitutional? I just don't buy it. Number two would have had the same volume. It's the second one in that area, and there's another one that's not coming to mind. But they did have this in Waterloo Region previously, right? That's where the first decision came from. But I suspect you're right. Like the fact that it was stopping a major infrastructure project then probably propelled whichever reporter it was to ask about that decision. Right? It happened, on a Friday, and then the premier was available. So I think it's fair there. But I do think that the overall combo of a frustration with the Ford government and other premiers, right? He's not the only one, with the role the courts play versus the legislature. And you combine that with the growing unease people have, the lack of safety or the feeling that the pendulum has swung too far, I think that caused the premier to have a strong reaction that I think many average folks would agree with.
Well, the only thing
go ahead, John.
The only thing I would say is if you take a look at what people think on the approval ratings of the Ford government, all of these issues in terms of whether it be healthcare, the environment, social services are all underwater. I mean, really underwater, like in the 20% to 25% approval rating for a lot of this stuff. So there's this veneer at the moment without a liberal leader to kind of puncture it, that the government stays afloat and does this. And I guess I come back to this and say, yeah, you can express yourself in various ways, and it must be frustrating. But it goes back to, this is a premier who is the mayor of Ontario as opposed to the premier of Ontario. I mean, the issues that he's upset about are the bike lanes and Ontario Place and a spa and the science center and things like that. There are other people, and it is who he is. And I'm not criticizing his focus on what he's doing, because that's just who he is, and he's been elected duly. But there are other premiers who would say, look, we're going to do something about housing in this province, and we're going to do it in a big way. And part of housing means shelter, and shelter means people who don't have access to shelter, and we're going to work with mayors to do that. You see, that's the thing. So again, there's no way in which, we're going to change the man. That's not going to happen. But I think, again, you're kind of in your third term. You've got all of this political capital. The question is, what do you want to do to use that? And what we get is more of, yelling at the judge. The second thing is, we'll see where that ruling goes. Guess what? There's an appeal process. Guess what? Might get thrown out. There you go. It just seems to me that as the premier of the province, he could be focusing on the broader issues with some kind of legacy aspect to it, and it's not happening.
Keith, the whole question, though, is that, I get that the initial reaction was, flash and fire and everything else. But Monday, he came back and they were at Ontario Place where they were talking about the Science Center and said it again. Now, he didn't threaten to send the encampments to the judge's backyard. So there must have been some conversation in those 2 or 3 days that said, we're on the right track here. This is the right response.
Absolutely. They've gamed this out. And he would not have brought it up again Monday, as you say, at an unrelated news conference at Ontario Place. That's just, he couldn't help himself. And again, he did go after the judge. But that's when he said, and he's looking at the notwithstanding clause. So he took it a bit further on Monday than he had Friday in Sault Ste. Marie. So he's clearly feeling they're on the right side of this one. And perhaps Tim is bang on that this is how most of the people, most voters now feel, that they've had enough of these encampments. Just clear them the hell out. I mean, you're going to have to get them somewhere. You can't just dump people out, but get them out of our family parks. And I think there's a whole lot. Now, this one's in a parking lot. I know I'm generalizing here, but there's a lot of attitude of just people have had enough of this crap. I say crap. It's other people's lives that they're trying to survive and live through this. But people have just the whole mess of it all in their neighborhoods, in their face every day as they go to and from work, to and from school. People have lost sympathy. They're really at the point of just clear this the hell out, deal with it. And one that's in the way in a parking lot of blocking a major transit project, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of public sympathy for them there. And I think Premier Ford and the Conservatives have figured that out. They've done some polling, probably in all likelihood, and thought we're on the right side of this one. So I think Tim is on the right side, and the rest of us are being a little bit more sympathetic, but to the people who are suffering in this parking lot, living homelessness. But I think overall, most voters have had enough of this, and like Tim, think it's time that the courts backed off and let the government deal with this issue in some way. But the government, should be putting the funding in, as we've talked about, and they're not doing that to the degree that's clearly needed, or the municipalities would be able to afford to help these people, and they can't. So it's a really tough issue overall, but Ford, I think, has gamed out the easy way. Just say, the judge is crazy. We can't let this happen. And I think, as I say, there's no sympathy left for the people who are living homeless.
Well, Kathleen, we heard the sort of similar argument this week around Union Station and some of the challenges that they've got with, fentanyl use and all of those sorts of things. So this is not specific to smaller communities. I mean, Toronto is struggling with the same kind of issues in terms of dealing with people who are on the street, encampments, et cetera, and Toronto is unable to manage it.
Right. I'm trying not to yell. I'm trying to be very calm. Because when, when you have a government that refuses to look at the evidence of what actually works, and we can talk about bike lanes, we can talk about what's going on in education, closing down outdoor education centers right now, we can talk about housing, we can talk about, Tim, you talk about the heart hubs. There's evidence coming out that there's more obvious street drug use because of the shutting down of the supervised consumption sites than there was before. So when a government refuses to look at the evidence and build social policy and economic policy, because they are related, if you think that the disorder in our streets doesn't have an impact on the economy of our cities, then you're kind of missing the point. So if you don't put the building blocks in place, if you don't build the right kind of housing, if you don't put in place the income supports that are necessary, we saw in the basic income pilot canceled, which would have actually given us evidence to start to revamp the social assistance program so that it would work for people as opposed to trapping people. So if you have a government that doesn't do that, then you're going to end up with these, bright, shiny objects. And for the premier, who's probably mad at the judiciary in general because they still are saying he has to put his cell phone records out in the public, he's probably just mad at judges, period. But it means that you don't have good policy. And so therefore, things start to not make sense. And I think that's where we are right now. It's like, okay, fine, deal with this one situation in Waterloo and move these people out to go God knows where. But what's the systematic response? What is it that the government is doing to actually build a systematic response to a problem? Look, I'm not happy with there being people sleeping in the street for, two reasons. One, it's uncomfortable for those of us who are walking those streets and living in those communities, and it feels scary. But the second thing is, how on earth can we, in this richest country in the world, have people sleeping on the street and not getting what they need? So there are two parts to it, But if the government isn't willing to look at the actual solutions and follow the evidence and put in place the resources, then this is where we're going to be, and it's going to get worse.
They're able to blame the victims. The longer this goes on, the more people that are homeless, the easier it is to say they are the problem, as opposed to addressing the problem and keeping those numbers down.
Right. So the pollsters can say, as you say, John, that public opinion is on the premier's side. Sure, public opinion is on the premier's side because there hasn't been a good public discussion about what the solutions actually are and what needs to be done. And so all we see is the tip of the iceberg of the problem. And then we have nonsense about, the dangers of all these things like supervised consumption sites, like bike lanes, none of which is related to the reality of what the evidence shows.
Well, even just to clarify that, I mean, the public is on sign with get those people off the grass. But if you look at the numbers as well, they're going, yeah, but you've got no affordable solution or real solution because all the other issues related to that are underwater. So it's kind of like get them off the grass is the first part of the equation. Okay, got that. Where do you put them? What do you do about it is the second part. And in some of these cases, only 2 in 10 people in this province agree that the solutions are being put in place by the government to deal with these things. So it's both sides of it.
So the public is smart. The public actually does know what's going on, but the surface response is, just deal with it, and that's what the Premier's responding to.
A last one. I know we've talked this one up. Could have been a great discussion. A lot of passion. I just feel, again, this is not an area of policy expertise. Hopefully, I'll do some client work in this area. It's one thing I really enjoy about my job at council is, diving back into issues across the spectrum. But it occurs to me, Dave, too, just you look across North America, right? This is a North American phenomenon. I don't know if Ontario is better, worse, average, or visiting out west and seeing the huge encampments in British Columbia. Seattle, I lived for several years, right? The whole downtown is paralyzed, no doubt an addiction crisis, fentanyl. Something has clicked. And yep, sure, shelters for sure. Treatment. I think public opinion in Ontario was not in favor of the supervised injection sites, nor the federal centers that give away drugs, on taxpayer expense. But it strikes me there's got to be something deeper here, whether that's, forced treatment at some point in time, getting rid of the bifurcated system that has all levels of government, none of which are making progress. It's got to be something deeper here going on than just something in our province.
Yeah, one of the things that came up, and I dropped the episode into the On the Ledge feed. It was from Now and Next last week, and I'd mentioned that I was talking to Dr. Cindy Locke, head of school at Pickering College, and all of their programming there and curriculum is project-based. And so she got into talking about how they have an impact. And what they did, one of the projects, is they addressed a homeless shelter question in Durham Region that got voted down by the council by 1 vote. And the students were asked to get involved with Blue Door. And they came back with a solution. And one of the things, Tim, that kind of came up was the biggest issue was stigma around homelessness. And I think we've kind of skated around all of that today. And so I don't know how we can deal with all of the policy issues you want in terms of providing services and everything else. But unless we kind of address the stigma issue, it becomes a really complicated or more complicated than it already is.
I think you're right. Right? Our neighborhood, when I'm in Toronto, Yonge and Lawrence, right? They would march probably to stop any homeless shelter from coming anywhere near their neighborhood. We used to deal with NIMBYism when it came to housing. You're absolutely right. It's far stronger. As I said, I may have a chance to work on helping to site a shelter somewhere in Ontario. It'd be exciting if we actually get that work. I can, dive deep down, but you're absolutely right. I think the stigma barrier, how many people would put their hands up, honestly, to say put a shelter, down the street from me.
Yeah.
I just want to jump in just on one thing, and that is just on the public opinion polling for a moment. I've done work, and it's in the public domain, on safe injection sites in the greater Vancouver area, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, the GTA. And it's much more complicated than a single question, do you agree or disagree with them? And what it really is the people across this country in the municipal areas believe in safe injection sites. They just don't believe in having them in neighborhoods where you're going to get needles placed in different, on the front yards of people and close to schoolyards and stuff like that. So they're not in favor of the draconian thing of, well, we're just, take them and dry them out. They are, and I can tell you from, not one question, but 15 questions with item banks and going through this in a very deliberate fashion to understand without the contamination of the question form. The public actually is really smart. They do get it if you don't lead them along the way. What's happened here oftentimes is that there's a really kind of black or white approach to dealing with homelessness or these other pieces. And people are quite reasonable if you say, these are the options. How would you like to play it? So I guess, again, I come back to this and say there's 2 different ways you can look at this. One is it's either a ballot question on homelessness, which is get them out of the park. It's tougher to go through all of those other issues and come to a solution. But goodness me, when you live in a city where doctors can write a prescription for people to get a shelters over their head. There's something missing in the public policy space here, and there's too much politics in it. So I think you're right on the top line. You can get this, reaction of stop this, get them out of here. I don't like dealing with it. I don't think our neighborhood should deal with it. But let's not assume for a moment that the public doesn't think that there are other steps that should be taken, and they're reasonable ones, not hard, reasonable ones to move people who are in these vulnerable positions into a better situation.
John, have you done polling, though, that actually says that they would go for, Tim used the phrase, forced treatment? Would people support the idea to help these people eventually by getting into forced treatment? Or is that too far?
Well, forced treatment is, again, it's a complicated issue. I mean, you are removing the rights of somebody. I mean, it's almost like if you go to CAMH, for instance, and somebody goes in and says, "I want to kill myself." I mean, what you then do is you give a form, and they lose their right. They lose their rights to do anything, and you take them in and you fix them, and then you let them out a month later after they've been treated and deal with that. So the question really is really, where the public believes that they should be taken and moved to another place isn't necessarily without their rights. It is, in fact, I've done work in Alberta on exactly the point that you've done it. Again, the ballot question, move them out of here. I don't like them. If you give them a reasonable path, because people believe that there are some people who cannot, I mean, we could go for a whole hour on this. I mean, the fact that there are people who are addicted to opioids can oftentimes start with a toothache that then goes to the dentist, that's then given a vial of opioids, and there you go. So, moving them forward off of the street is not a draconian measure that most of the people, maybe 30% of the public, is in favor of. Most people are reasonable that if you say this is the path to take and they could have more of a collaborative effort, they're really much more in favor in that. So all I'm saying is it's pretty draconian, a lot of these things. The public is willing to take that ballot question, no question, if that's all they have. But if you go through the process, you see a much more open embrace of potential solutions.
Yeah, even that your question around, or bring up the subject of the accessibility of opioids, most people, I think, would be shocked at how easy it is to get it legally, and when you don't need it, right? So there's a whole bunch of, you're right, John, the layers in the question are really the challenge in the whole conversation. Just quickly around the table, anybody have on their bingo card last week that we were going to have a referendum on a referendum in Alberta?
Me.
Did you? Okay, there you go.
On a referendum?
Well,
Yeah.
and I was in Alberta last week when last we spoke, and I'm not surprised. I think that, as I said last week, the people who just want to send a message, the send a message crew must be pretty happy about this referendum on a referendum, because I think it will encourage them to, vote for that as opposed to voting for staying because they want to send a message. So I'm really worried about this. I think it's a real challenge and very divisive for the country.
Tim, it was interesting to see, last week when we were talking, maybe upper Canadians should just kind of back off, sit in the sideline, just be quiet, hands on our pockets, not really engage in the conversation. And almost immediately the prime minister's out there saying it's a dangerous, what did he call it? A bluff. So again, I kind of looked at that and thought, that's probably the leadership statement that we needed.
Yeah, it looks like Premier Smith trying to have it both ways, right? Which is, would Thatcher say about standing in the middle of the road, you get run over? I would think I was a minority opinion on this one too, where again, always the caveat, other province, we don't know all the dynamics. Yep. Jason Kennedy was on my wife Deb Hutton's show on News Talk yesterday, and I missed it. So I don't know what he said, because I think he'd be really interesting to listen to. But look, my gut was on it. If there was a provincial law that said if you get to a level of support for petition, you'd have a referendum. The judge intervened. So my gut was if you actually hit that level, then you should actually put the question. Have the question defeated, champion for a strong Canada, be crystal clear on that, as the federal Conservatives said they're going to be. But man, if otherwise, I think it boils over, particularly if one of the grievances why some Alberta residents are there was over our judicial reactions to what they would feel as individual provincial rights. I think you got to call the question.
Yeah, Keith, the point around those who really want to leave, they're not going to be enticed by any kind of conversation around pipelines or resource development or big infrastructure projects in Alberta. They just want the hell out. So the premier shaking hands with the prime minister might be actually does more for the separatist movement than not.
Well, absolutely. I mean, these people are hardcore. They don't care if there's a pipeline in the works. They don't care if the grievances that they've raised are being met. They want out, and they want the publicity from this. What they don't like is a referendum on a referendum, which I guess is good. If they don't like it, I guess this is good for the rest of us. But it does give, I think Premier Wynne nails it there, it gives people that are just upset and want to send Ottawa or Upper Canada a message, just, hey, back the hell off. Just we're pissed off and we really want to make you aware of that. That's where that, polling of 25 to 30% support for the separatism, that's where that could go way higher. People wanting to send that protest vote. And that is scary. And I think that's why the prime minister said what he said and calling it a bluff. It's a dangerous bluff. I mean, let's face it, the economic implications of making Alberta unstable for investment, and that's what you're doing, it's just ridiculous. I mean, we saw what happened in Quebec. We saw the minute they started voting that way in the referendum, the 401 exodus down to Toronto with the corporate headquarters and whatnot. This for for Alberta, I think is just more uncertainty, and a referendum on a referendum just prolongs that process. I kind of agree with Tim that the court should have maybe let this one go, or maybe went too far in this one, but the premier took it to her advantage. She had an out card there and didn't take it. She decided to double down and go with this referendum on a referendum. So she's doing more than playing footsies with the separatists. She's trying to keep the United Conservative Party united around her and this base, and I just don't think that's going to happen. I think Jason Kenney and other conservatives with a little more common sense, perhaps, in their thinking will be able to sway the day as this plays out.
Yeah, but okay, so you're right. She is playing footsies. They showed up at her convention and ripped a piece out of her because she wasn't moving forward. And so she's had to accommodate it with her own with her own body. Last time I checked, the same people that are ripping her were not exactly having a fun time with Jason Kenney. All right. So there's a core group within that party. She's trying to hold it together. Number two, the judge basically throws it out because she doesn't have consultation, especially for First Nations. Right. So she shows up at the Premier's conference yesterday, and the Premier of Manitoba rips her one and basically, in the nicest possible way, basically says, hey, you know what? That judge was right. You got to consult on fishing rights and things like that. And she's kind of at the microphone going, so okay. So she's done the middle step. She's the one in the middle where she kind of goes, okay, I got to appease a base of mine who's in this political party, or they're coming after me, so I'm going to do it in between. She's also said that she's not going to support it. I mean, and it does open the door for a referendum that has no binding effect. So all the same conditions can play into it. Jason Kenney can get out there and say things. The prime minister can say things. They can do whatever they want. The thing is, though, that they've got to get out there and deal with this, because if you have a referendum that is based on a referendum type question to go the next route, that the people who are most likely to get out and vote are the people that want to get out. So you can't leave it just hanging in the air. You've got to actually, if you only got 30% out to vote on this, and half of them, in fact, were the ones who want to secede, then you've got 50 to 51% in that vote. So it's kind of a mock trial, but it's the only thing that she's got. And, the sooner that everybody wakes up to this and says it is the middle ground, we have to do it. Once it's done, if they lose that, it may not be done at the political level, but she's in fact maneuvered this so she keeps her party together. The prime minister has a chance to keep loading in all kinds of things to make Alberta better. But we've now got a forum to discuss this. And even as Wab Canoe said, you know what? The judge is right. We have to consult in this, and it's up to the province to do that, not just the people in general.
I did want to get to the sort of the aftermath of the jet fallout. And then Keith, you brought it up. The premier was ticked off. Nobody's more ticked off than he is that they had to pay $200,000 to give the jet back that he says he needed. But this has just dropped into the inbox. The prime minister says Canada has entered into negotiations to buy the Swedish-made Saab aircraft over the U.S. And we're into the final week of the legislature here in Ontario, final weeks in Ottawa, and Kathleen, we're moving into the sort of this deadline, pressurized conversation around trade. Is this coincidental?
Probably not. Certainly the communication of it is probably not coincidental. There must be some strategy around pressure or messages being sent, but you know what? Above my pay grade in terms of what's actually being talked about in those negotiations. But there do seem to be noises about there's movement. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, and I just wonder what kind of summer we're actually going to have then, Tim. If this is kind of where we're at. This is a significant announcement from Ottawa in terms of where we're going to go around sovereignty, around defense, around all of those things, trade with the United States. What kind of signal do you expect this sends and is received? I guess is the more important part in Washington.
Negative. I'm not sure how loud that's received in Washington. I got to really dig in because weren't the American jets recommended by the military as a best fit for you? So this always, I worry this could be an own goal. Look, my understanding is that negotiations are not really proceeding at much pace at all. More so with Mexico. I think a lot of it depends on President Trump actually turning his attention, back to Canada. And he's got a whole bunch of other issues that he's focusing on instead. So because they're so personality driven, these trade relationships, I think we're in a bit of a stall as a result. I just think you make the right decision for our mutual defense. And well, I've been saying this since last January, February. I still remain a long-term optimist. I don't see rupture. I see rough waters, right? And I just think of our integration with the American market, our integration on the defense side, a shared goal in having a North American security. I don't see China as the answer, and it's pretty hard to put goods on a rail line or in a truck and get them over to Europe. So this decision I worry is to appeal to anti-American sentiment and is ultimately damaging to our defense. Not so much the American relationship and all, but this is the wrong direction.
Yeah, John. Just for context, I talked to Scott Clancy, and you know Scott well. He's a retired Major General of the RCAF, and his view was that we should go with the Americans. So there is a military perspective.
But no one has made a decision on the Gripen. That's not what's coming out of Ottawa this morning. And in fact, it bodes better for the F-35 than it does for the Gripen. That's where Scott's argument is. What this is about is an aircraft, which is an early warning signaling part of our northern defense. That's what it is. It's an agreement with Saab and Bombardier. So in a sense, the announcement is being made at CANSEC, which is the gathering of all the defense people, and it's threaded the needle. Remember, it's Saab that has this aircraft as well as the Gripens, and it's basically an up-the-middle thing. It's kind of like, well, we could get the Gripens, but we're going to get this one instead. It hasn't taken the F-35 off of the table. It's threaded the new needle because we're into this new agreement with defense sharing in terms of production with Europe. And this, in fact, does that. So it's really important that we understand what kind of aircraft this is. And it's not the Gripen, which in fact people were saying should be another aircraft to offset the F-35. That is still on the table. I think from a political point of view, having made this decision public this morning, it actually guarantees the Prime Minister's got his entree into Europe with the Resilience Bank, with the defense procurement that we're now part of. We used to only be able to get 35% of our stuff through there. Now it's 80%. And it satisfied Saab, who'd been lobbying so hard for the Gripen. This is the other thing that says, okay, well, you don't get the Gripen, you get this. So it actually holds it intact and quite possibly leaves it open for the government to stay with the F-35.
So that actually is the strategic play.
Yeah.
John. Yeah.
Right. So and again, we're recording this Wednesday morning. This is just kind of the information is starting to creep out. So things will have changed by the time you probably hear this. But I just think from everything else that's flying around, it was an interesting timing on the whole thing. Well, let's get to some.
I was just going to say Canada and the United States and Mexico have resumed negotiations on trade and tariffs this week without Canada. And, they're talking about, well, we want to make these same deals with Canada, but they're not inviting us to the table. So I think this, again, just part of John obviously said a whole lot more than I could ever understand even about what's going on with this deal, the strategic placement of it. But
Premier Wynne said it right. It's just strategic. So.
But overall, I think it was just part of the message that, we need to get at the talks, and we're not just going to be beholden. You don't get to dictate the terms, I guess, is the message from Canada with this one, is you don't get to dictate all the terms.
Well, let's get to a couple of HR issues. And Nate Erskine-Smith appears, Tim, to be in the rearview mirror for the most part now. The Liberals, I thought, were very decisive. They were quick. They were transparent in terms of their review of what happened with the by-election nomination for the party. All good.
I had to see most of my time to Premier Wynne about this because I've enjoyed her rants about Nate Erskine-Smith. I sense that she wasn't part of his campaign team. Look, I've seen him in action quite a bit and interacted with him. I also was a very bright guy. I think when your risk is that you're seen as being self-motivated about yourself, the way you've dealt with your position in the federal caucus and a couple of prime ministers, the last thing you want to do is make the leadership all about yourself for the Ontario Liberal Party, right? You risk looking selfish, self-motivated, not caring about the party. And if you're going to have a burn the party down approach, you got to have some evidence about it than that you yourself are aggrieved. My guess is he's done some tremendous damage to his viability going forward. Over to the Premier.
Well, yeah, and I think not coincidentally, the day after or on the same day that we saw the report released, Kathleen Navdeep Bains says, "Oh, I'm over here, and I'm going to, be part of the process to run for the leadership."
Yeah, and Nate Erskine-Smith said that it's going to be much more difficult for him. He was quite equivocal in whether he would continue his leadership run after the report came out. What I just want to say about the report is that David Zimmer is the head of the team that wrote the report. Tim, you know David well, and he's a thorough guy with a ton of integrity. So he did what needed to be done. I think it's great that they got the report out quickly, and Nate will make his decision. I would be very surprised at this point if he continued his leadership bid, but we'll see. As I said to somebody, or I guess I said to John Moore, it ain't over till it's over. So yes, Navdeep Bains is coming in, but who knows? Somebody said to me a few days ago, until Navdeep Bains came in, everybody was a nobody. And I reminded the person that Dalton was a nobody and I was a nobody and Mike Harris was a nobody. Like, there are a lot of nobodies who actually become quite competent politicians and do good work. So we'll see. But I think it's way more challenging for Nate now. He's kind of shown his hand. He's shown who he is. And I think it's going to be difficult for him to rally the Liberal team.
Yeah, well, I won't put you on the spot, Kathleen, but I'll ask Keith, is this sort of a healing for the Liberals here in Ontario?
Well, it could be a start of one. I mean, they took a lot of heat for just the way this was handled. And again, that was Nate Erskine-Smith at the center of it all. So I think if he lays low for a little bit and perhaps doesn't revive his leadership campaign, it is a bit of the healing for the Liberals. And they get to focus on who the new candidates are, watch them come in and launch their campaigns and get to learn about them, before November 21st. So it's, I think it's the right way to get there. It wasn't a good start, but now that it's behind them, it's right for the Liberals to just launch into the long leadership campaign, have the candidates declare the way the process should unfold. And I'm sure for most Liberals, it's what they want to see, just a nice normal process where we have candidates, we get to pick on them and vote them, and then, have the big vote in November.
Well, I think he's. I'd be more definitive. I think he's dead as a doorknob, and in terms of.
Tell us what you really think, John.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, at the end of the day, this really has nothing to do with polling or my views or anything else. It's who sells the most membership. So I'm not really sure with this kind of reputation and with that kind of a flank force, he's going to be able to do it. But you know what? If he tosses his hat in the ring, he's against other people who may sell a lot more, and they're going to peddle on what's just happened. So my verdict at the moment as a non-pollster, as a person, just an observer. I'm not sure he's in the game. I don't think so.
Before we go, Tim, I just want to get your take on the Caroline Mulroney announcement. It seems as though that caught a lot of folks by surprise. I heard Deb Hutton talking quite personally and passionately about Mulroney's commitment to public life and her family and all those sorts of things. But there's still this level of skepticism that, in fact, this is a chink in the armor of the premier, that politically it makes a statement about the state of the cabinet and, where some of the front benchers are actually looking elsewhere.
Yeah. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right? That expression works in politics as much as in life. And so last topic, I think Liberal Party did handle that nomination well. Kathleen made a good point. David Zimmer, highly respected, in this political world. In the past, we had party disputes, and Patrick Brown was leader, sort of inside, and the decision came, take it or leave it, and someone to the court. So process was well done. Back to your main question. Yeah, Caroline, I think tremendously respected in the Ontario legislature broadly, and the cigar is just a cigar. This is somebody who has come to a crossroads. I don't think would have run in that last provincial, was not expected to run in the 2026 campaign. It went a year early, right, in January, February of 2025, and stayed on given what was at stake with the Trump tariffs and the reaction. Somebody has tremendous opportunities outside of politics. She still be in early 50s, highly credentialed, smart, successful career before politics. So that's a lot of doors out there. Plus, now an empty nester. Father passed away. Believe it or not, and there's a U of T study to back this up, Dave, 83% of politicians actually are human beings. 17% maybe not. You can judge for yourself where I am. This is a very human decision, a big loss, no doubt, because of the talent and integrity she brings. But this is life, and just some very exciting things ahead for her outside of politics. And thanks for her service.
Yeah, Kathleen, I heard people saying, well, she just ran last year and she should, fulfill the whole mandate because now we're going to have to spend the money on this, that, and the other thing, and began to question her motives around this. I don't believe that she's got an issue with, her dad died 2 years ago. She got to get over it. And people were almost that explicit in saying it. And then, say what you will about her politics or whatever you might, but boy, to kind of hang those personal motives out like that, I thought, really?
Yeah, I mean, people are so skeptical and vicious and cynical, and I mean, the woman has a life, and she made a decision, and she probably, as Tim said, didn't expect that election to be called and felt obligated to stay, and I totally get that. And the prospect of staying another 3 years just is not what she wants to do, and I think more power to her. I don't know Carolyn at all. I know her. I knew her a little bit in the legislature in those 4 years that I stayed after the 2018 election. She's not a street fighter. That's not her, her kind of motivation is not to be in the thrust and whatever cut and thrust of politics. I think she's a policy person. She's calm, she's rational. But maybe she had a combination of she had just had enough, and she wants to do other things. I take it at face value, honestly. And, even if in a few years she decides to come back and do something in political life, that doesn't mean that in this moment, this isn't the actual reason that she wants to get out. She needs to do this right now. Maybe she's got something that she wants to do in terms of her professional life, but the family's very, very important, and she's on her own, or she and her husband are on their own now, and it's a different phase of life. So I had not heard the cigar is just a cigar, but if that's what we're going with, then I'm good.
It's Psychology 101. That's all I remember from that course.
It seems like a very masculine image for this moment. But
It was Freud. Yeah.
Oh, she's a class act. I mean, when you really think about it, and to your point, Premier, I mean, when she was in the transportation portfolio, it was a little difficult at times, but she found her role in Treasury Board, and she's had a very public stage, especially with her father, but she's a class act. She's done her public service without real controversy whatsoever, and just there comes times. I'm always wondering, Tim, when you say 83% are human beings, what are the other 17% like?
But are there subgroups in that 17%?
Yeah, well, she definitely falls into the 83%, that's for sure.
It was said when she ran for the leadership that she was doing it for her dad. And it kind of seemed that way at some times. And I think a lot of her career, I think, could in part of it be because of her dad, because she didn't need to come into politics at all. She had a pretty successful career beforehand and can, I think, walk into many opportunities going forward. But the family is very close. And I think it's important for her to just get away now. And, there's always the jumping from a sinking ship and all that kind of, well, look, anytime a cabinet minister leaves, you get that kind of stuff. But I think this one does look to be someone who's just, had enough of political life for now, ran an extra year. The election came a year earlier than she planned. She stuck around because it was requested that she do so. And she's doing the honorable thing. She's walking away when she can. Would she come back? I don't know. Someone who runs for leader once, I would think, might have a minute to run it again, but who knows? I mean, that's for sometime in the future. But I think just to accept her, I think John summed it up. She's a class act, and I think that's how most people viewed her.
All right, well, let's leave it there, shall we? We got a little bit more runway through the rest of this week, but the legislature will be, I guess they wrap things up next week, right, Keith? That's their last week? Okay, so, and then we'll hang around and before we sort of take a break for the summer, but we will be back next week. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Thanks to Tim Hudak, Keith Leslie, Kathleen Wynne, John Wright. I'm Dave Trafford, and have a great weekend.
Pay no attention to that